Hi and welcome to an Outdoor Adventure Studies tutorial on fire lighting. Today in our tutorial we're going to talk about the components and characteristics that we need to take into account when we're lighting a fire. We're also going to look at 3 different methods in which we can utilize to try to make an effective fire. When making a fire, it's important that we firstly have all of the right equipment so that way we have everything ready to go to start our actual fire. The first thing we need to provide is some form of ignition. Now, in this case, we're using a flint as my ignition. We could also use a lighter or some form of matches. Now, what we need to look at then is our flammable or our fuels, which are going to be used to try to actually start my ignition and keep the actual fire continuously going. Now, if we don't have the luxury of something like newspaper, which is going to give us our immediate fuel source, we can use things like dry grasses or perhaps any forms of brown leaves. Now, as we start to move our way up, we start to look at some of our smaller pieces, which we call tinder or kindling. Now, notice I've got it set up here sequentially, so that way our tinder is actually getting larger as we move our way through to our block of wood. Now, the reason it's important to understand this concept of tinder and increasing the size of our wood is that these smaller pieces have a larger surface area, which means they're actually going to burn more rapidly, which means we're going to be able to sustain or start our fire more quickly. Okay, the first fire that we're going to look at today is a teepee stack. The first thing we need to do is we need to establish our flammable fuel source. So as I've said before, we can use paper if we have the luxury of having it. If we don't, we can get away with things like dry leaf litter or some form of dry grasses. The first thing we need to do to establish our teepee is we need to use our small base tinder to create the start of our teepee. Now, once we get the start established, that's the most difficult aspect because we need to obviously have that element of balance to make sure that it's actually going to stay up. Now, it is a lot easier when we have a sand base or some sort of ash at the bottom of our fire pit, because that's going to allow us to establish our teepee component. Now, what I want to do is I want to provide our fire with a really healthy amount of tinder at the base, because as we know, this is going to be our fuel source, which is going to light really quickly because of its increased surface area, but at the same time it is going to go out relatively quickly. Now, if I was lighting this fire now, it'd be at this time that I would actually use my flint or my ignition source to start the fire. Once I've got a flame going, we're then going to start to build up with our larger pieces of wood the rest of our teepee. And again, depending on the size of the fire that we want to create, will depend on the size of the teepee that we're going to construct. Now, the advantages to the teepee structure is we can actually get elements of air and oxygen to flow through it, which is going to allow the heat to build up based on the ignition triangle of fuel, our actual ignition source, and also our elements of oxygen. All right, our second fire construction we're going to look at is a stack. Sometimes we call it a house. Firstly, we're going to start again with our combustible fuel source, so the stuff that's going to light really quickly. What we're going to do from here, same process, we're going to use our smaller tinder base, and what we're going to start to do is create a square with our biggest pieces around the outside. Now notice what I'm trying to do here is to create a perimeter around the outside of my fuel source. You can see that as I'm working up, I'm starting to come into a pyramid style shape with my stack. so it starts to get more and more narrow. Now again, similar to my pyramid, it'll be at this stage where I would ignite and light using my flint. Once it's then lit, again, I can use my bigger pieces to start to develop my stack. Now the easiest way to go about it is we lay 2 lateral pieces, 2 side-on pieces. And as we can see, as we start to get larger pieces of wood, it starts to become a little bit more strong and stable in terms of its integrity. All right, the final firelighting method that we're going to look at today is something called a lean-to. This is probably my favorite firelighting method because it's sort of an all-in-one, and also because of its simplicity. Now with our lean-to, we're going to use our big block of wood, which usually wouldn't be added till far later in the process, and we're going to use that as our base. Now the advantage to a lean-to is it offers a really good protection from the wind. Now if our wind was coming through in this direction, we're actually going to use our block of wood to allow some protection for our fire. Similar to all of our other attempts, we are going to load in our really flammable fuels, so our papers, our dry leaves, our grass litter, and again we're going to use our smallest bits of tinder to start to lean towards our block of wood. Hence the term lean-to. So as you can see, it's offering a really good piece of protection and a really large surface area for that tinder to actually catch. Now again, similar to our other processes at this stage, can use my ignition to light, and then I'm very carefully, as it's lit, going to start adding my larger pieces of tinder up against the lean-to. Now the fantastic part about this process and this method of fire lighting is while we're building our base, we're starting to actually get some ignition and some fire onto our smaller bits of tinder. We're also starting to heat up and start the process and the reaction of burning our block of wood. So the whole process is actually working towards our sustainable fire. All right, so now we've had a quick look at our flinting steel, let's give it a crack. So I'm adding just a little bit of oxygen to get my combustion going. And hopefully some of my tinder will start to light in a minute. Alright, so some of my tinder is actually starting to light. You can see that it's starting to smoke, it's starting to catch. So from here, what I want to do is start to add my really thin bits. I can find the source of the heat, and I can actually start to add to it. Now, importantly here, I don't want to just smother the flames. I still want to give it room to breathe. But now that it's starting to really catch on, I can start adding my tinder on as necessary.